Hey everybody, I am back with another lecture. This time we're going to be talking about culture and what is it? What is it? What is culture? Um, I should start by saying that there's a lot of linguistic confusion about culture. A lot of times when we say culture, we might be referring to a culture, which we could confuse perhaps with a nationality, or we could sort of like layer them on top of one another. So, you know, if I were to say something like, "Tell me about your culture," you might say, "Well, I'm Mexican, or I'm Irish, or these sorts of things." And not that that can't be a culture, but that's a very very specific meaning of the word culture, and it really conflates culture too much with nationality or ethnicity or even the idea of race. So we're going to step back from all of that because there's a more broad definition of culture in anthropology, and that is what we are generally going to be talking about when we talk about culture. So the first thing that we need to get out of the way is that when we use the word in anthropology, we do not mean culture to be the same thing as ethnicity or race, for example. Those are three different words with three different meanings, basically, in cultural anthropology. Okay, so throw that out the window right now. We can come back and revisit it later, but just remember those three are not the same thing. So there's sort of a history to the definition of culture, how this word came about, how it's taken on different analytical meaning in the social sciences and in anthropology. So we got one example going back to the Victorian era in 1871, where Sir Edward Tyler, this hirsute man with the beard on the upper right, he was a British sort of social and cultural anthropologist. He said, "Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society." That's a pretty decent definition. However, it definitely has a Victorian bent to it in that you're focusing on particular institutions, particular customs, things that are much easier to articulate, things that are much more tangible. And I don't know if Edward Tyler himself would have said this, but there certainly would have been many people in his era that used the word culture as a quality that you could possess more or less of. For example, going to the opera is seen as very cultured, right? High culture. You can have people of sort of the upper classes that are more cultured than working class people, and of course the great British institutions of democracy and representative government, et cetera, are more cultured than savage tribes. Again, I don't know what his particular opinion on this was, but if he was a man of his time, that would have been a common kind of assumption. So a little bit later on, and this is the definition. This is sort of the way that we understand culture. It's closer to how we understand culture today. This is by Franz Boas, who's this guy who looks a little nutty on the lower right hand side. He's the guy that is at the foundation of the American Four-Field School of Anthropology. He said, "Culture embraces all the manifestations of social behavior of a community." So note, community could mean a lot of different things. So we're not necessarily talking about a state society like a country. We're not necessarily talking about an ethnicity. Community could be defined on a whole lot of different levels. So all the manifestations of social behavior of a community, the reactions of the individual as affected by the habits of the group in which he lives, and the product of human activities as determined by these habits. So that is a little more nebulous, but it gets at how permeating and how pervasive culture is. So the reactions of the individual as affected by the habits of the group in which he lives. What does that mean? It means that humans are constantly learning, whether it's active learning or passive learning. We might not be, I mean, right now you guys are actively learning, and I am actively teaching, or doing my best. But we also learn through observation, right? We learn through observation of the media, of adults around us, of our peers. So we we get ideas, and kind of guidelines for how to act and how to react, sometimes without even realizing it, oftentimes without even realizing it, and then we act based on these assumptions. So think of something like getting dressed in the morning. Of course, there are intentional things that you do when you get dressed, and sometimes why you're doing something, but there are intangibles as far as like what looks good, what doesn't look good. Well, where does that come from? Does it come from someone always telling you what's good and what's not good? It comes from your media, how kind of how our society views body image, what's seen as attractive versus unattractive, what is seen as professional versus unprofessional. So again, some of this stuff is explicit, but a lot of it isn't explicit. And when you are getting dressed, you are getting dressed for a particular occasion, whether that's a casual thing, or it might be a job interview, or it might just be going to class. So when you're doing that, you're not actually thinking about all of the assumptions that are built into why you're going to wear what you're going to wear. Sometimes you just kind of know these things, right? So the reactions of the individual as affected by the habits of the group in which he lives, or she, and the product of human activities is determined by these habits. So it's kind of all of that. It's hard to separate one culture from another culture, and in fact, in a lot of ways, it can't exactly be done. It depends on how you're defining culture, right? So let's kind of simplify this using a metaphor. This I believe was something that Franz Boas also used as an analogy. Culture is like a set of lenses through which you see the world, right? So when you're putting on these glasses, it colors your view of everything, and these type of glasses are such that you can't even tell that they're on your face. Actually, I wear contacts, so that might even be better, right? I can't actually see the contacts in my eyes, thankfully. So, if I didn't know that I was wearing contacts, and they were colored, for example, I would probably think the world was a different color than it is. Or if they had some kind of blemish that was constantly in my line of vision, I might not know that is not just a part of the world outside of me, right? So culture is such a part of who we are and how we perceive what is outside of us that it's really hard to look at culture from the inside and say where its edges are, how my culture colors my world in a way that might be different from someone living in a completely different community, right? Sometimes the definition of culture is not actually the easiest way to understand it. An easier way might just be characteristics of culture. So here are some characteristics of culture as defined by anthropologists. Culture is learned, so it's not something you're born with. So we're not talking about an instinct, right? We're not talking about something that is necessarily biologically inborn, okay? So culture is something that's learned. And it might be learned, again, actively, like you see in this picture here. The mother is actively teaching her child to read, or to teaching the alphabet, okay? Or it can be passive. So the child is looking at her mother right now, and she's taking in all kinds of clues about body language, about emotions, what a familiar face looks like, her mother's style, all these things that are unconscious, right? Culture is also symbolic. It's a way, because it's something that is learned and it's social. There are also it incorporates ways of interacting with one another, and every kind of interaction, maybe not every kind, but many kinds of interaction are symbolic. Language is symbolic, right? There's nothing, the word computer. I mean, there's nothing inherent about the word computer that has to mean this thing that I'm recording on, right? You can have different words in different languages for the same thing, right? Water. That word is just a symbol for an idea of a thing, right? So language is symbolic, body language is symbolic, our understandings of how we're supposed to present ourselves is symbolic, like a handshake is symbolic, okay? And culture is shared. So you can't have one person that has their own culture. As much as you might like to, that wouldn't be culture. That's just one person's idiosyncrasies. Okay, so culture is something that is understood by multiple people. So that's what makes it a social, something that social scientists would be studying. Okay. And as I said, it's all encompassing. It's like my contact lenses. I can't tell, kind of where the edges are. I can't tell I can't really separate how those contacts are, like what they're adding to my perception of the world outside me, and what is objective outside of my contacts, right? Integrated meaning how we view things with regards to, say, economics is a part and parcel of how we view things in terms of our origin story of, in our country of, religious freedom and freedom in general, and rugged individualism, and it also goes along with religion. Like everything is tied together in a complex web. You can't really separate out one thing and say this is outside of culture, or this part of culture is not impacted by these other parts of culture. If you pull on one thread, there's going to be ripples throughout the web, right? Instrumental, adaptive, and maladaptive. What does that mean? That means instrumental means it can be used. Obviously, we use culture all the time to communicate with one another without thinking about it. But you can also manipulate some of the symbols in culture that are taken for granted. A great example is, and I know this seems like forever ago at this point, but when Colin Kaepernick, took a knee to protest police brutality and things like that, why was that so powerful? Whatever however it makes you feel, on whichever side of this debate you fall on, why is that so powerful? That's so powerful because he took symbols that we all understand, and he put a spin on those symbols, right? What the flag represents, what you're supposed to do during the anthem, the way you're supposed to stand with your hand over your heart, and all this type of thing, and what taking a knee could represent. It can represent respectfulness and attentiveness. It can represent a liminal state somewhere in between sitting and standing. But the point was, it's an attention getter because he understood whether this was extremely planned out in this particular way or not. He understood that this is a powerful symbol, and that he can use that, right? So it's instrumental. Adaptive and maladaptive means culture is what makes our species so successful, but there are also obviously destructive aspects of culture sometimes. So the human capacity for culture is adaptive, but there can be maladaptive aspects of culture at any particular time and place. Okay. So a definition that you should know is enculturation. That's the process through which culture is learned and transmitted across the generations. It's part of enculturation is obviously active teaching and learning. Part of enculturation is observation. Again, this picture, contains both aspects of that. And so when you live in let's say you move to somewhere far away that's different enough, the people in this community or region of the world have different enough understandings of things that things are a little strange for you the first time you set foot in this place. But slowly, over time, as you interact with people, you will become enculturated, and you will start to understand what you can do, what you can't do. Here's a great example. I did my research for my dissertation in Poland, and obviously it's a country in Europe that has pretty much the same kind of economic base as we have. There's a lot of shared history and connections, but it's different enough that little things would stick out. Like, for example, when I went to any kind of store, there is no with the clerks at the store. There's no "Hi, how are you? How's your day?" No smiles. It's business. I'm not your friend. I'll check you out. Let's go. Keep it moving. And at first, I sort of thought, well, that's rude. Why are all these people who work at stores so rude? But it's not that they're rude. It's that we have different expectations, right? In our culture, it's expected that even if you don't know someone, and even if you don't really care about them all that much, you pretend like you do. It's like, hey, at least start off on the right foot. Whereas there, it's sort of like, well, why be fake? I don't know you. I'm doing a job. So our interaction is going to be real, and it's going to be functional, and it's going to be quick. When people get to know you is when they become warm and will put themselves out there for you. So it's a different sort of cultural approach. But I became enculturated as I lived there longer and started to understand the way things worked. And actually, people got to know me at some of these places and warmed up. So anyway, is culture unique to humans? That's an interesting question. I'm glad you asked. Well, what is it that allows for culture biologically? Clearly, there's something different about humans in terms of culture compared to other primates and other animals. Learning and memory, we are much more intentional about teaching and learning actively, and we have larger cognitive regions of our brains that can aid in learning and memory. Sociality. So obviously, culture is social, right? So a social species would have a propensity to share, some ideas of behaviors. Language is something that's important. Obviously, we possess language to a different degree than other animals, even if they have ways of communicating and things that might be considered in a rudimentary sense, kind of like language. The capacity for abstract thought and symbolic thought, that's much more developed in our species even than in our like our closest primate relatives. Now they certainly have a capacity for some abstract thinking, but there's a difference of degree. Opposable thumbs helps. Obviously, you don't need opposable thumbs for culture, but in order to create tools and to manipulate things, opposable thumbs are quite useful. So there are examples of culture in other animals. If by culture we're talking about behavioral repertoires and perceptions of the world that are shared among animals in a community, are symbolic to some extent, are learned. Birds and otters and chimpanzees, and there's a number of animals who are known to use tools, by which we don't mean hammers and swords and computers and I don't know, whatever else you can think of, but taking an object that is outside of themselves and using it for a functional purpose, like chimpanzees you see in this upper picture. Some chimpanzees, not all chimpanzees everywhere, but some chimpanzees have learned how to do termite fishing, which is where they will take a branch or a twig or a reed or something, and they'll sort of strip off anything coming off the sides, to make a nice straight kind of rod, and they'll stick it into a termite mound, and the termites cling and they sort of attack it, and then the chimpanzees just eat them off of that like a popsicle. And so that is rudimentary tool use. There's other chimpanzees that, like on the lower right hand picture. Well, I guess that's more termite fishing, but there are other chimpanzees who have figured out how to crack open nuts using rocks. So there is tool use among chimpanzees and among some other animals. Not just using, but making. As I said, like these reeds, obviously they didn't make the reeds or the sticks, but they did sort of make improvements to them for the purposes of termite fishing. There's also examples of chimpanzees washing food, even hunting. Now, not hunting with tools so much, but hunting in terms of sort of entrapping smaller primates. Sometimes a group of chimpanzees will get together and sort of corner a smaller primate and then just sort of tear it limb from limb and eat it. In terms of culture, we can talk about the degree to which culture is shared, how far it's shared. So universal would be something that all humans, in this case, we're talking about humans, something that all humans share. And if all humans have the same cultural practice or the same perception of something, it's because, for the most part, it has evolved in our species and has biological roots. I mean, that's a fairly safe assumption if everybody has something like this. So all humans have some form of language, right? All human groups, whatever kind of language it might be, whatever kind of language family it belongs to, sign language, All humans have some form of language. Year-round sexuality. I know that sounds like kind of a fun album name or something, but year-round sexuality means that there isn't generally like a period of like rut or heat. Some other animals, their reproductive period is very well defined, and they generally don't really reproduce outside of that period. Humans, we are always ready. We are always ready. Tool use. All human societies use tools. There's different kinds of tools, different levels of complexity, if you want to say that, as far as the tools go. But all societies use tools. And all societies organize their social world in terms of kinship and relatedness, not necessarily in the way that you might think or in the way that we do, but all societies use some form of kinship relations. So these are things that are universal, that are probably evolved biological kind of instincts or abilities. Now, there's also things like that are shared generally among multiple different societies, and those cultural traits can be due to a shared history. For example, our kind of representative democracy has a shared history with, going back to ancient Greece, but even more closely with, with some ideas of government from like Western Europe. Colonialism or conquest, right? So like the Americas in general, right, share a lot in common with whether it's language or institutions with parts of Europe because of colonialism. So so much of the Americas speak Spanish because of Spanish colonialism, Portuguese, English, French. There can also be sharing just through interaction, right? So it doesn't always have to come from some kind of socio-political domination. There can just be sort of interaction as well. And you could also have something where, so those things are called sort of diffusionist. That's a diffusionist perspective where cultural practices or ideas will spread from one locus to others. They will sort of diffuse. But there's also a different perspective where, well, it's not completely different, but it could also happen where things are the same kind of solution is developed independently in two different places, right? So you might think of certain seafaring technology. It might not have been invented just once, but actually invented several times in several different places because they happen to have, maritime borders. Okay, so you can have that as well. There are some things that might be particular to one sort of region or one community as far as cultural practices, and that could be because of the relative isolation of that place. So there might be some groups in the Amazon that have certain features, not all of the features, but certain features that are relatively novel because it's much harder for there to be diffusion, although it is not impossible. Regardless of what you read in the media, there are no societies that are untouched, unaffected by anything in the modern world. There's pretty much no such thing. So it could also be due to recent invention. So it might spread eventually, but for now it's confined to kind of the area that it was born because it just hasn't had a chance to spread yet. Or something that's a solution to an uncommon problem, Maybe you live at extreme, your society's at extreme high altitude, and you found a solution to certain problems that exist in that environment that others have a different solution for. And maybe the surrounding areas are not at high altitude, right? Also, there could be contact between sort of two communities, but a particular trait in one community, a particular cultural belief or behavior or practice, doesn't diffuse to the other society because something about that trait clashes with the values or beliefs or practices in the other society. All right, so how do cultures change? This is something we'll talk about later on in the semester, and I'm going to try to go a little bit more quickly now. Cultures change through diffusion, which is what I was talking about, basically from different communities interacting, bumping up together. Sometimes there's a power dynamic there. Sometimes it's on a more equal footing, but it's basically borrowing. Acculturation is a sort of hybridization when two groups are in continuous contact. So plenty of that went on in the Americas. Food is a great example of that. If you look at different cuisines in Mexico, there's a great blending of indigenous ingredients and preparations and ingredients and preparations that were either brought from or borrowed from due to constant contact, Spain and parts of Southern Europe, and even al pastor. Those of you who are fans of al pastor, that type of preparation comes from, I believe it's Lebanese immigrants in Mexico City, and it sort of became uniquely Mexican. So acculturation, also independent invention. Okay, so all of these things can be sources of change in a culture. Structure versus agency. Man, maybe I will get to this in more detail in another lecture, but another way to look at our possibilities for change. I'll talk about this more when we talk about how cultures change at the end of the semester. So I'll go through this quickly. Structure is kind of what's outside of us that we're born into. There are institutions that exist. There's languages that exist. There's a history that we can't change. So we're born into the world where there are already certain possibilities that exist, certain possibilities that are quite difficult. We're not born into a blank slate. We're born into a certain landscape. So I'm talking metaphorically now. There are mountains, there are rivers, there's places that are harder to get past, there's places that are easier to get past, right? Think of that as structure. In society, that can also mean rules and laws and institutions and power structures, right? Agency is your ability to make choices within that structure, right? So as much as we'd love to sprout wings and fly like a bird without having to get into a plane, you're just not born with that inborn biological capacity, right? So that's a trite example, but that is a way to think about. Like there are certain impossibilities or extreme difficulties, right? There's certain realities in the world. Now you can make choices within that. So and the choices that you make within a structure can serve to reinforce the structure or contest the structure. So you can play around with it to try to change things external to yourself. Okay. So this is the last slide for culture, but you can belong to many cultures. at once. Okay, so again, get out of this notion that culture is exactly synonymous with either nationality or ethnicity, because you could have cultures associated with those things, but within those things too, you can have cultural aspects that have to do with your religion, right? I mean, we're all here in the United States. Well, I suppose since we're not sitting in class, you could be taking this from anywhere, but let's just assume for a second. So we're in this nation, but it's a nation made up of many different religions and ethnic affiliations and this and that and the other things. So you can be American, but you can also be Ethiopian American, or you could be a Christian Ethiopian American, or a Muslim Ethiopian American, or right. Family, your family has its own sort of understandings and inside jokes and practices. So you could say your family kind of has its own culture in a way. Different schools have different cultures, right? Some are more kind of traditional and strict, and some are more kind of liberal and looser in terms of structure and tradition, right? So a school can have a culture. Your workplace can have a culture. Groups of your friends can have cultures. Activity groups that you're in, hobby groups that you're in. Maybe you do gaming that has its own kind of cultural aspect. Maybe you do dancing or music. So it's all these like overlapping layers. So culture is just a sum of ways that we interact, ways that we understand, ways that we perceive things, and oftentimes it's so obvious, it's so in front of your face that you don't see it. Okay, so that's a quick. Let me see if there's anything else. Oh, musical taste. I already said that. So that's quickish intro to what is culture. So keep that in mind as we go and we talk about other cultural practices and histories, and when we talk about cultural relativism and so forth. Okay, so have a good day, and I will probably be seeing you soon with another lecture. All right.